My name is Nkechi Taifa. I'm president of the Taifa Group, LLC, convener of the Justice Roundtable Coalition, and a longstanding proud member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, NCBL. I am so very thrilled to moderate this auspicious panel this evening on behalf of NCBL's Criminal Justice Section, exploring issues surrounding the abolishment of the criminal punishment system, and I welcome you. Please be sure to put your name, organization, and state in the chat area. And we request, if you have any questions, to please place them in the specific Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will take Q&A at the end of the presentations. Let me tell you this, NCBL is not new to this issue. Indeed, the mission of the National Conference of Black Lawyers as the legal arm of the Black Liberation Movement is to dismantle the criminal punishment system in the US and to replace it with a system that has as its priority ensuring that all communities have the essentials necessary for them to thrive. We advocate that behavior that violates the codes of honesty and sanctity of life be addressed within the framework of a community-based approach. Ultimately, the goal of the section is the creation of a system to address what is now termed criminal behavior in ways that heal and restore. And when the community determines that punishment is needed, it should be imposed in a humanistic, holistic, fair, and just manner. As such, the section supports and will work towards the abolition of the prison industrial complex and its systems of mass incarceration and over-policing. We understand that the first step in realizing this vision of dismantling prisons and policing is to ensure that there is a shared understanding among our supporters and allies of the issues that our people face and the essentiality of implementing this vision. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the beginnings to the NCBL, National Conference of Black Lawyers Justice System Vision, which you will be able to find within the next couple of days on the NCBL website, www.ncbl.org. And we want to take this shared knowledge and vision throughout communities in the US, creating educational materials, toolkits, videos, public discussions, policy developments, trainings, in an effort to raise consciousness around the need for abolishing the current US criminal punishment and policing system. So again, we welcome you to our first educational forum, tonight's webinar, building on the movement articulated by NCBL's client and sister, Dr. Angela Y. Davis, to abolish the current criminal punishment system. And that is the perfect segue with which to introduce our guest panelists for this evening, which we will begin with by none other than Sister Angela Y. Davis, a sister who really needs no introduction to anyone, past, present, or future. She is a legendary icon in our midst, a world-renowned abolitionist, author, activist, and professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And just before I bring her on, I would like to share a quote from Sister Angela. And she says, quote, "Revolution is a serious thing. The most serious thing about a revolutionary's life is that when one commits oneself to the struggle, it must be for a lifetime." End of quote. And as we have seen for the past 7 decades, it has indeed been a lifetime for Angela Y. Davis. So I'm going to kick off this conversation with Angela, and then after that, we're going to introduce the 3 additional phenomenal panelists. We'll bring Angela back for a brief concluding remarks, and then we're going to open it up for some Q&A, and then we will close with what I hope will be a call to action. So with that, Sister Angela, Dr. Angela, okay, my sister, you founded critical resistance. I was there at that founding back in the day. You published Are Prisons Obsolete in 2003, Abolishing Democracy in 2005. Have there been changes in the conditions of the criminal punishment system over the past 15 years that lead you to modify your views that were included in the foundation of critical resistance and expressed in these books? Share with us.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Nkechi. I want to thank the National Conference of Black Lawyers for a lot of things, but of course for asking me to join my wonderful panelists in this conversation about abolition. Of course, my ties to NCBL go back to 1970 when Margaret Burnham and Hayward Burns and Lennox Hines and Howard Moore and other members of NCBL became directly involved in my defense. So I thank NCBL over and over again for the work that you did to save my life. Now, with respect to the question, first of all, I can't take responsibility for this abolitionist movement as an individual. And, you know, I always point out that all of the ideas that I have written about, that I have organized around, have been collective ideas. And so if we want to talk about critical resistance, back in 1996, a number of us got together here in the Bay Area, scholars, activists, former prisoners, artists, feminists, Marxists, etc. People who had been thinking about prison issues for a long time. We wanted to organize a conference that would bring people together from across the country. As it turned out, people responded from other places in the world as well. And we had no idea that there were so many people doing grassroots work around prison issues. We thought that we would be successful if a few hundred people showed up at the conference. As it turned out, some 3,500 people came to Berkeley to participate in this conference, which we decided to call Critical Resistance Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex. And we said critical resistance because we thought that it was critical to engage in radical resistance, but also our resistance should be informed by critical thinking and critical engagements. And so as we organized against what eventually came to be called mass incarceration, we watched the incarcerated population soar. It was about 1.5 million, I think, when we started doing the work. And less than 5 years later, there were 2 million people behind bars. We felt that people should be brought together who were doing anti-prison work, which is, I think, a term we used at that time, around a radical analysis, an analysis of the racism, the class and gender bias of the prison system. And so we came up with this term, prison industrial complex, which had been used by Mike Davis to describe the economy of the state of California that was moving from an agriculturally based economy to a prison-based economy. And we decided to use that term because in those days, the very mention of prison or people in prison caused many people to shy away from conversation. Even people who had relatives behind bars were often ashamed to admit that they had loved ones in prison. And so our initial goal was to demystify that whole process, to make it very clear that people who were in prison weren't there largely because of their own actions, but they were there because of a system that refused to address a whole range of issues such as education and housing and healthcare and jobs. And so our analysis was anti-capitalist, it was anti-racist, and it was also feminist. And we realized early on that we had to focus on abolition, but at that particular time, people were not as receptive to abolition. I mean, I can remember people saying to me, "You're absolutely out of your mind if you think we can abolish the prison system." It's funny because I gave a talk at Harvard, invited by Henry Louis Gates back in the mid-90s, and the talk was on abolition. And he really challenged me. He said, "You know, you can't be serious about that." And then when I saw him after he had been arrested himself for trying to get it, he said, then he got the point. He began to realize that there was something serious about that analysis. But let me just say briefly, we introduced abolition not for the first time in our history, because it was the Attica brothers. I mean, my familiarity with abolition came initially as a result of the Attica Rebellion. When I heard the brothers there calling for an end to the prison system as we knew it then. And so we began to think about the role that reform has played, because everybody always capitulates to the notion of prison reform. As a matter of fact, even people who have an abolitionist perspective are often called prison reformers. And what we wanted to show was that actually the very history of incarceration has been the history of efforts to reform the prison system. And as a matter of fact, reform has been the glue that has kept the system together over the last 2 centuries. So we realized that it was really important to introduce the idea that there were other possible ways of addressing harm and all of the other issues that the criminal legal system pretends to address. But at the same time, we recognized that there were a range of issues that had absolutely nothing to do with harm or with crime. And those issues have to do with the capitalist arrangement and racist arrangement of our society. And I mentioned jobs and healthcare and education and so forth. So I don't know whether I would say that my views have changed since then. I think fundamentally they're the same, but they've expanded. And one point that I would make is that police abolition was always implicit to that analysis. And as a matter of fact, NCBL participated in many of the efforts to bring attention to the racist character of policing early on. We were all active in the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression and had numerous tribunals all across the country to which we invited international jurists to participate. So that has become much more explicit recently. And I think that something that is really important to include in the analysis is the immigration detention network. As a matter of fact, if one looks at the privatization of prisons, the fastest growing sector of the private prison complex is immigrant detention. And I think that especially now, it's important to focus on the ways in which the carceral system has expanded to the extent that it touches most of the people in this country, certainly working class people, even those who don't recognize it, even white people who may not recognize it. So I think that one, and I'll end here, that one other element that has expanded is the gender dimension of the prison industrial complex, and the ways in which looking at women's experiences in prison helps us to better understand the role that carcerality plays in this society. And of course, the work that trans prisoners have done has helped us to understand how the whole system has an ideological impact on not only on people who are directly touched by the prison system, but by the entire society, because the prison system is also a gendering apparatus. It very concretely does the work of gendering and of maintaining a gender binary system.
So, Angela, thank you so much for that response. And you basically said that your views have not necessarily changed, but they have expanded, over the years. But what I want to raise for you right now in about 5 minutes that we have, what about the climate overall in the United States over the past 15 years? Well, shoot, why don't we just say over the past year? Do you think that the climate here has changed? I mean, amongst activists and folk who are out in the street, such that the vision of abolishing the criminal punishment system and creating a system that's humane is becoming more acceptable to the broader, the non-radical, society. So what do you think about conditions overall in terms of people out there in the streets? Is it more acceptable now, these concepts that you have nurtured all these years?
Well, yeah, the quality and the quantity of political activism that has happened in this country over the last 20 years is absolutely amazing. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact that activists have had. I know that both Whitley and Daquan are from North Carolina. And in the state of North Carolina, really amazing abolitionist activism has been unfolding for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And oftentimes people assume that when there are sea changes in the way in which we think about the country and the world, that they happen spontaneously. Many people assume that Ferguson represented a kind of spontaneous uprising, but no, it was because of the organizing, the work that people don't necessarily get credit for, the work of engaging around issues of education, incarceration, not incarceration and the school to prison pipeline, education, not incarceration, the work that disabled people have done around issues of incarceration, the anti-racist work, of course, that has been unfolding. So I think that that what we are witnessing right now is the degree to which the work that appears not to have an impact initially, the extent to which that activist work can change the world, can change the way people think, and can change the way we dream of the future.
Wow. So we're about to hear from some of these activists now in terms of their vision and their dreams. And then we're going to bring you back for just a couple of concluding remarks before we open it up for a Q&A. So I would like to, we're going to first hear, I'm going to introduce them and then they will speak. We're going to first hear from Whitley Carpenter, who is a staff attorney at Forward Justice, a law policy and strategy center dedicated to advancing racial, social, and economic justice in the U.S. South. Her work reflects her strong commitment to advocating for and uplifting the voices of oppressed and systemically disenfranchised communities. She's participated in the planning and implementation of more than 12 clean slate clinics across North Carolina. She's filed thousands of expungement petitions across the state. She serves on the advisory board of the Durham Expungement Restoration Program, and she's an active member of the North Carolina Second Chance Alliance. And she sits on the National Board of Directors of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and is vice president of the North Carolina chapter. The voices of the directly impacted are critical, as we will next hear from Daquan Peters from Wilmington, North Carolina. Daquan is the new Hanover County Second Chance Alliance coordinator, where he organizes campaigns on criminal and social justice issues. He is also a staff member at Link Incorporated, a local nonprofit reentry organization where he provides supportive services for those returning back to society from incarceration. And our final panelist this evening is Mark Fancher. Mark is a lawyer, he's a writer, an activist who's been with NCBL for nearly 36 years. And I remember when he first came into NCBL, so I've been around longer than that. He's the author of the book, Genocide with a Smile. And throughout his career, the focus of his work has ranged from police misconduct to over incarceration, to racially discriminatory school discipline, to unannounced planned closings and employment discrimination, and more. He has consistently worked to achieve liberation and self-determination for Africa and the African diaspora. And he currently works as a staff attorney for the ACLU of Michigan's Racial Justice Project. So what we're going to do is we're going to have 2 rounds of questions. The first round, our panelists will have about 7 to 8 minutes to respond, and the second round we'll have about 3 to 4 minutes. So Whitley Carpenter, let's begin with you, my sister. Criminal justice reform is a common term that we hear when discussing the criminal punishment system or criminal legal system in this country. The National Conference of Black Lawyers vision statement and a personal mission of yours, I do know, is not to reform, but to abolish the system as it currently exists. Whitley, talk to us about how you feel we should begin this work towards abolition.
Thank you, Nkechi. And I'll just start by saying good evening to everyone. Thank you for having me as a panelist, and I'm honored to be up here with these amazing panelists. And thank you for this question, Nkechi. So I think about abolishing the system with 4 different categories of actions. And I think that the first and one of the most important categories is really changing the narrative and mindset of the community that we live in. So honestly, as long as we continue to talk and use their language and their definitions of what reality is, we're going to be lost. So we have to reimagine what criminal justice means and shift the culture so that we're operating in a rehabilitative framework and not this punitive framework that we've been taught is the only way to do it, the only way to exist. And if we really want to see this change in framework, I think that we have to start shifting culture. I was always taught that when you shift culture, law and policy follow. So in order to begin to shift the culture of our criminal justice system, and Sister Angela touched on this a little while earlier when she said that there was shame associated with knowing people in the criminal system, is really thinking about language, right? So we have to remember that when we're talking about the system, at the core and at the crux of this, we're talking about people. We're not talking about inmates. We're not talking about ex-cons. We're not talking about felons. We're talking about people. And those terms that people use, those terms that have these negative connotations that make people stray away, those terms don't center humanity. Those terms describe people's conduct. They don't describe the people. And I think language is such an important part of our culture that it's really important to think about our language in this context and to always remember to center humanity. And then as we're also talking about shifting culture, we need to think about proximity. So Sister Angela also mentioned that it wasn't until someone was actually impacted themselves that they understood the issues and they actually began to understand the abolition framework. And so proximity really allows you to see, it allows you to care. It allows you to better understand the experience of impacted people. So our leaders in this abolition movement, they have to be close to the issue. So the movement needs to be led by the people who are most directly impacted by the system. Wise man once said, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So as we're continuing to shift culture, we have to continue to actively educate our people on the system and how it was designed to oppress us, and it's doing just that. And in that same light, we have to begin educating our people on what's possible, which brings me to my second point, which is visioning. So there's really no abolition without reconstruction or the building of something new. But what does that something new look like? So part of the problem is so many people have a hard time visioning something unfamiliar or something that's so contrary to all we've ever known. A few years back, I participated in a training called Harm Free Zone through a local community, women-led community group in Durham called Spirit House. And we did a lot of exercises that made us really answer questions like, what does safety mean? When do we feel most safe? What does the world that we would like to see look like? So I really want to challenge all the participants here to begin thinking about what this world could look like and begin breaking those barriers of what society is telling us that safety is. And that's how we begin to vision what comes after abolition. Because I really believe that the first step to our freedom is going to be able, or is when we are able to admit that we have colonized minds, and everything that we've been taught since the beginning of our existence in this country came from a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal frame of thinking. And so we have to move beyond that, and we have to start visioning.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, were you finished, Whitley?
I had just a little bit more. So the third part is really building capacity and power in our community rather than in the system. So thinking about where we put our resources first. So we need to start investing in indicators of health and success and wellness in our community rather than in the system. People talk about putting money into police departments and giving prosecutors more resources, but we should really be putting that into our communities for more economic opportunities, more green space, eliminating food deserts, affordable and safe housing, educational opportunities, access to healthcare and mental health. And as we're building those resources in our community, we also need to build people power. Think about all the historical movements in this country. Those were people that organized and built power. A mentor of mine always says that we don't win because we're right. We win because we're strong. If you look at the Bureau of Justice statistics, they estimate that the United States spends more than $80 billion each year to keep people locked up. And a lot of experts say that that's an underestimate. So I would say we're right in saying that's not an effective expenditure, but it doesn't mean that that's been changed. Or if you think about the fact that 40% of our prison population is Black, another 19% is Latino, and another 1% is Native American, that means 60% of our country's prison population are Black and brown. And I think we're right that that's morally unacceptable, but it's still the case. So we're right about a lot of these things, but we have to build power so that we can be strong in order to change them. And I think the last point, and I'll stop, Nkechi, is harm reduction. And that's in the meantime, because we know we have a lot of work to do. A lot of community education has to happen. A lot of power building has to take place before we're really gonna see abolition of this system as it exists. But we have to impact people's lives right now. So we're sitting here tonight, we're talking about abolishing the system, we're talking about educating, we're talking about power building, but people are still getting beat, people are still getting abused, people are still getting killed, people are still locked in cages with inhumane conditions. People are still treated like second-class citizens for the rest of their life after they made one mistake and not able to really escape that vicious cycle. So we have to work in this moment while we're continuing to work towards abolition. And you'll see in the vision statement that Nkechi mentioned earlier that will be on the NCBL website, some of the actions that we mentioned that we support. And those actions that are listed in the vision statement all work towards harm reduction in the meantime as we're fighting for abolition. So we can build more power when we have less people locked up. So we have to do this prosecutorial work. We have to hold decision makers accountable. We can build more power when we have secure employment and aren't being held back because of a criminal record. So we have to do these expungements. We have to advocate for more policies. We can build more power when people don't have to choose between paying thousands of dollars in fines and fees or feeding their children. So we have to advocate for those policy changes. And we can build more power when we're enfranchising our people who are directly impacted by the system. So we need to change these felony disenfranchisement laws. So as they say, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Educating, organizing, power building. This is the work towards abolition, but simultaneously engaging in these harm reduction practices, because we know that this system that we're trying to abolish is harming our people right now.
Absolutely phenomenal. Y'all fire me up. Thank you so much for that, Whitley. And, you talked about we need to, just reimagine what justice is, reimagine what safety is. You talked about proximity, and that's a great segue to our next speaker, because we're going to talk to someone who has been very, very proximate to these issues that we've been talking about. We're going to bring up Daquan Peters. Daquan, where are you? Daquan Peters describes himself as being directly impacted by the criminal punishment system. And Daquan, I would like for you to share with our almost 150 people on this webinar right now, just a little bit about your experience and just how that shaped your view and stemmed your passion for abolishing the system. Take it away, Daquan.
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to participate in this beautiful discussion. Honored to be here. As far as my experience with, this system, this just us system, as I call it, because it's just affecting us. I would say started when I was enrolled in elementary school. I feel as an African-American young man or child born here in America, my path to the criminal justice system was already set for me because of the way the system is designed. As far as my experience growing up in a community where, crack didn't skip my household. So, I come up in a household surrounded by the things that a system flooded my community with. Participating in ignorance, I allowed myself to become a part of destroying a community that I now, consider myself to be an asset instead of a liability to. I've been to prison 4 times. My last prison sentence is what really woke me up. I was sentenced to 262 months in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for 10.3 grams of crack cocaine. That in itself was a wake-up call, a life-altering wake-up call for me to really wake up and see that something ain't right about this, because there's no way once I get into the system and started, educate myself, because I knew, the numbers that they was giving me, that they was telling me, it's impossible for me to be facing this amount of time. It's just simply impossible. Not when you're telling me that a person with 5 kilos of cocaine can get less time than me. And crack, you can't get crack without powder. So as I began to educate myself on the federal system, I began to see all the racial disparities. I began to see all of the wickedness that was being issued to us. I mean, you tell me I'm a career offender, yet the charges that you are saying that I'm a career offender for, I paid my debt to society for. I went to prison for those convictions. I served my time for those convictions. I came home from those convictions. It's been 10 years since I committed that offense, but yet here I am today. You're going to use that same offense against me again to give me 262 months in prison. Then once I enter into the system, I began to study, as Whitley said, the language. I began to realize that lawmakers intentionally make, the word in the statute, state and federal statutes, vague so it will criminalize a broad range of behavior for people like myself that look like me. So therefore, when I realized that the wording within these laws was strictly put there, set by design to be able to cage a person that looked like myself, and once I educated myself to this fact, I said, there's no way I'm going back into society and not take what I learned while incarcerated back to my community, because they need to know these type of things. They need to know that I'm surrounded by brothers who you know, got life sentences for 2 grams of crack cocaine. And because of the way the law is designed, they can actually get relief, but because of statutes that says that they didn't exhausted all their remedies, yet we made a mistake and said that this prior conviction no longer qualifies to give you this life sentence, but we sorry, you can't get back in court. Now this person has to sit in here with a life sentence. Then you got people in there with 40, 50, 60, 70, 6 life sentences plus 90 years. Man only got 1 life to live. You give him 6 life sentences plus 90 years. I'm looking at all of these things and the way the laws are designed. And that shaped my perception to see that something ain't right. Then now as I sit in here for 12 and a half years I did off of this prison sentence. For 12 and a half years, I've sat and watched politicians say that the 100-to-1 crack cocaine ratio is a racial disparity. There's a racial disparity in the 100-to-1 crack cocaine ratio, and that it disproportionately affects the Black community. So as an individual that's sitting in prison with 22 years, listening to you on national television on CNN telling me that y'all made a mistake and that something got to be done, that's a slap in the face to say, yo, you shut up. This is where you're supposed to be. You'll sit there till I say you can get out. Unless I get up off my behind and go and study the law and fight you with your own words and fight you with your own language. Surround myself with people that's been activists, that's political prisoners, that's actually political prisoners that's sitting in prison right now because of their ideology or whatever they might feel or whatever they feel is right. And here in America, we don't get that choice as a Black person. And I realized that. It took me to get 262 months to realize this. So that's what fueled my passion to come out here, because now I'm no longer blind. Before I was operating out of ignorance because that's what you was feeding me. When I realized he who prescribed the diameter of your knowledge will prescribe the circumference of your activity, then I realized that ignorance to the law is no excuse. And if anything that I do that I don't understand, they're gonna lock my Black behind up and throw away the key, and they ain't gonna have no problem with doing it, even if they're right or wrong. I've seen cases where people dead to the right. I've seen it all. I've been impacted by the criminal justice system on every aspect of my existence. And you tell me that we made a mistake or what we thought then was right, or no. How can you think that when I've educated myself on the real war on drugs or how the war on drugs started? I've educated myself on Nixon. I've educated myself on Reagan. I've educated myself on all of these people that you tell me when I come before you, I got to accept responsibility because I gave somebody crack. But the CIA and all of these people don't get to accept responsibility for putting it in my neighborhood.
So Daquan, I hear you loud and clear, and I can just feel your passion as to why the system must be abolished. I mean, back then when I was fighting that crack versus powder cocaine, if we had been talking about abolish the system back then as opposed to just reform that issue, we might be further than where we are now from what Dr. Angela Davis was saying before. Sometimes when we were talking about reform, we were really just buttressing up the system. So I feel you, and I'm gonna have you come back on after we hear from Mark Fancher again with another question. But I really appreciate your passion and your proximity to this very critical issue, and that's really a good segue to Mark Fancher, because Mark, will abolition of the system resolve the predicament of Black people such as Daquan Peters? Would it resolve their predicament who currently suffer and have suffered as a result of the system. Talk to us. Join this conversation.
Well, thank you. First of all, a warm virtual hug to you, Sister Nkechi. It's been too long. And much respect to my fellow panelists, and a special heartfelt, soul-felt thank you to Dr. Angela Davis, not only for all of the work that you have done, but for the example that you have set, your courage in being an icon. I don't know that people can really fully appreciate unless they were able to see it. Just the way in which you sent electricity through the Black world, by the way that you carried yourself with such dignity when the power of the entire empire was coming down on you. There is nothing that I can compare to the feeling that I had as just a boy when I watched you walk into that courtroom, with everybody with guns aimed at you, basically, figuratively, if not literally, and you flashed a broad smile and stuck your fist in the air. It was like a bolt of lightning, and so I thank you for that. But as to the question of whether abolition will resolve the predicament, I think we have to be very careful because we have to place that question within a historical context. We have to understand that there are two populations in the United States of America that didn't choose to have the United States of America as part of their existence. That's the First Nations of the Western Hemisphere and African people who were enslaved and brought here. And because United States was forced down their throats, they had to resist at every opportunity. John Hope Franklin in the book Runaway Slaves uses contemporaneous documents to demonstrate how enslaved Africans at every opportunity fought, contrary to the images that we see in Gone with the Wind. They were constantly breaking the farm equipment, setting the crops on fire, organizing insurrections, running away from the plantation, and when they could get the master off by himself, they cut off the master's head. So those are our ancestors, and those are the ones who set an example for our resistance, and one which we have tried to be true to with respect to the example and the tradition that they established. But it has also resulted in a consequence for us. Those in power, those who have always held power within this country, have understood that when you have a recalcitrant, a rebellious population, then they have to be controlled and they have to be contained. If you look at the way in which they controlled and contained the First Nations people who were also fighting and resisting the empire, they put them on so-called reservations, took them off of their ancestral lands, and in some cases made them walk barefoot across the country to places that were desolate. And there they stuck them, taking away their territory, engaging in a process of protracted genocide against these people and confining and containing them within what they called reservations. For the enslaved Africans, they contained and controlled them on plantations for as long as they could. But at the time of abolition of the slave institution, and there was the great migration north, then they contained them within what were called ghettos. But then our people, because we have a tradition of rebellion, burned the so-called ghettos down. And it became necessary to contain and control this population in a very different way. And the prisons were a very convenient and efficient way of doing that. So I answer the question by saying, yes, the prison system as we have known it creates many problems for us. It has been a way of containing and controlling us. But the interests that drive the elite, the interests which drive capitalism, the interests which drive the United States of America as an entity have not changed. And if we were to abolish the prison system, then it can be almost guaranteed that they will find another way to try and contain and control us as a people. And so therefore, while we must abolish the system, we can't stop with our objective as being just abolish the criminal punishment system. We have to abolish the United States of America. I mean, revolution is really the only solution to our problem. And until that happens, until there has been a comprehensive change, fundamental change in our reality in terms of the relationship between capital and labor, between the relationship between those people who were enslaved and those people who had their land taken away from them, until those communities have been made whole, until their situations have been fundamentally addressed, then we will continue to have problems. But certainly abolition is a good first step.
Wow, Mark, thank you so very much for that. And I just love your quote. Revolution is the only solution. You're talking my language, brother.
I didn't make that up.
Okay. It's all good. Nothing new under the sun. So we want to go back to Whitley Carpenter right now. And Whitley, in just a couple of minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, why must we go to what some consider the extreme measure of abolishment rather than reform? What are some of the challenges that may be associated with this goal? And I must call it an ambitious goal.
Well, Nkechi, generally you can't fix generally you fix or reform something that is broken. And as we all know, it's not broken, it's working how it was designed to work. And we've been reforming for a long time, and look at where we are. So the straight answer to that is we have tried reform and it doesn't work. I mean, we're still getting abused and killed. We still incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. We have the largest prison population in the history of humankind. As I mentioned earlier, we as Black people still make up 40% of that prison population, but less than 14% of the overall population. A recent example of reforms not working, just thinking about 2020, this Minneapolis Police Department, they had some reform practices adopted in their department, but somehow with those reforms, after continued misconduct reports, Chauvin still had the opportunity to kneel on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he panted that he couldn't breathe and called out for his dead mother. So this is why reforms are not enough. People talk a lot about a few bad apples when they refer to our policing system and other parts of our punishment system, cops, judges, DAs. But the reality is, one person once said that the whole barrel is rotten. And so that means that anything that we put into it is gonna rot because the institution itself is rotten. And because it's so fundamentally corrupt, it has to be uprooted. It can't be reformed. So instead of reformed, as I mentioned earlier, we need to start thinking about reconstruction and envisioning that new system, not spin our wheels trying to fix something that's working the way that it was supposed to. And so you asked what some of the challenges are, and Sister Angela said it best earlier tonight. Reform has been the glue that has kept the system together. I like that quote. But we have been reforming for so long that people may actually be convinced that the system can be reformed. And so that's an idea that we have to destroy. It can't be repaired. Additionally, reformist solutions a lot of times for policing, for example, they actually expand the reach of police. So things like body cameras is a reform, trainings, review boards, all of those things increase their funding and therefore increase their power. So our goal should be to decrease the overall impact in our communities. Another challenge, I think, is that representation can be blinding. And so while representation matters, we can't let it blur our ultimate goal. And so we think about inviting more Black people to be a part of white supremacist systems and having diversity and inclusion trainings, but that's proving to be ineffective. We don't want to be a part of this system. We want to dismantle it. So we really have to remember to always center our goals on dismantling this white supremacist system as it exists and not be pacified and take off our activist and abolitionist hats when we see this representation. I'm not saying we can't have Black people in positions of power, but we can't allow this to blur our ultimate goal, is what we see happening all the time. And I mentioned this a little earlier, but people just can't imagine a world outside of what we have now. There is no visioning. So there's a desire to not be oppressed, but we've been oppressed for so long that we can't even imagine or think about what it would begin to look like to not be oppressed. So the major challenge here is to begin shifting this framework that this is just how it is, and begin thinking about and working towards how it actually should be. And I'm gonna stop there because you said I talked too long last time.
No, you're good. I mean, you're raising some very, very critical points and giving a lot of food for thought. And that is what we need to do as we're about this process of reimagining. I want to bring Daquan into this conversation right now because there's a question that always comes up all the time, Daquan. I'm just curious as to your response to it. If we are abolishing the criminal system as it existed, how do you suggest that people be held accountable for their actions? 3 to 4 minutes.
Well, to be honest with you, years ago, I'd have said hold them accountable the same way they held us accountable and lock them up just because they white. But that wouldn't make me no different than them. And I'm better than them. I'm farther ahead than them. I'm more intelligent than them. They operate off of diabolical intelligence. I operate off of supreme intelligence and divine intelligence. So with that being said, I would say we hold on to the core values and principles that those before us, such as the sister Angela Davis here, and those before us, her, and with her, set for organizers to be out here to continue organizing. And that's the only way you're going to be able to hold these people accountable, is to make sure that you're right there in their face, watching them, make sure you're holding them accountable for every move. When they do something, you own them. Like she said, don't pacify them. Don't be scared. It's not too much more you could do to us.
So I'm just curious. Let me just bump in just for a second, if I may, because what if we're not talking about the system accountable? What if we're talking about, someone who busts in your house and steals something, or, bludgeons your wife? I mean, how do we deal with our own people? I'm just curious. Yeah.
Oh, and that's another thing, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because just as well as we have to hold them accountable, we have to hold our community accountable in the same way. And those that represent us has to be held accountable just as well as anybody, because we have to make sure that this is done in a proper and the right fashion. And the way we do that is by following the path of those who led the way for us to get to this point. And we just use our creative intelligence to enhance it and make it better, and make and raise leaders to be able to follow behind those behind us and help them to understand that you can't, don't harm me. I'm not your enemy. So, that's one thing, we have to make sure that we got to understand that we was taught to hate each other. We was taught to hate each other by this same system. So when you harm me, you just emulating something that you was taught to do to me. And I understand that. And I have to make you aware of that. And that's another part of the organizing that we must do, because we have to be the ones out there in the communities every day, putting our life on the line, being in those communities. Just me standing there talking to somebody, educating them on the criminal justice system can violate my probation, because 9 times out of 10, I'm talking to a convicted felon. But those are the sacrifices we make when we're trying to dismantle and abolish a system. We stand firm.
So I think this is really all a part of this whole reimagining, and this visioning that we need to be doing. Thank you so very much. So Mark Fancher, just how can we abolish a system like this when you got nearly half of the people who voted in this country, nearly half, I don't know, have a Trump-like perspective on how the country should function? How can we be successful?
Well, a few moments ago, I mentioned how First Nations people and Africans have been contained and controlled. White workers, too, have been contained and controlled, but in a different way. There has been a protracted process of psychological operations, which has been very effectively used to confuse these people, to disorient them politically, and to, buy into a whole thought philosophy of white supremacy. And they've also been given certain expectations that they will never be at the very bottom of the caste system which exists within the society. And whenever they sense that they are, then they lose their minds. And so, my personal opinion is that they have been so thoroughly brainwashed, so thoroughly confused, that at this point, even though they would be natural allies for oppressed communities of color, that they're not capable of it. They're just incapable of it at this moment. And for that reason, I think that what we have to do is to take a cue from the first century Christians. I'm a devout Christian, and I think if everybody, accepted Jesus, we'd have no problems at all. But I know not everybody is there spiritually, but they can be where he was materially. And what he was confronted with was a first century population of color in Palestine that was under occupation by an empire, by the Roman Empire, where the Roman soldiers routinely battered people, extorted people, and locked people down in much the same way that we do. And the response of that community was to basically say that they were going to divorce themselves completely from the empire, that they couldn't do anything else in terms of overtaking it or overcoming it, through military means, but they were going to divorce themselves mentally, spiritually, and economically. So they had a socialist system that they set up among the people who were part of that community, and they functioned autonomously and independently. They were just the first. Our people did the same thing later. We had maroon communities that escaped, during the slave era and set up communities and populations that were able to function independently and autonomously. We have enslaved Africans who escaped and who formed alliances with the Seminoles in Florida. And not only were they able to function economically and socially and otherwise independently, but militarily, they were able to defeat the US military in efforts that were made to attack them. The Republic of New Africa, had the same basic concept. And I think the resistance to our, establishing our own independent existence, the reluctance very often is from the perceived threat that comes from a powerful empire. But I think that what we have to keep in mind is that we have more power than we think. That while we may not be able to make common cause with white workers who've been thoroughly confused in this country, we have millions and millions of people around the world who live in oppressed situations, who are ready at the slightest indication to come and to stand in solidarity with us. We only have to look at what happened after George Floyd was killed and the way that millions of people poured out into the streets around the world in order to support us. And that is the source of our security. For those who advocate Pan-Africanism and establishing Africa as a base, militarily, economically, and socially, dynamite. But we can extend beyond Africa. We have solidarity with working and oppressed people throughout the world. And once we begin to spiritually and politically understand that that's where our allegiance should be, rather than to the red, white, and blue, then I think that we are in a position to overcome any of the resistance that we face in this country, because we really do have the power on the planet. We just haven't recognized it. And it's been the objective of the capitalist class and the imperialists to make sure that we never see it.
Wow. And I just love that quote you gave, Mark Fancher. We have more power than we think. We have more power than we think. In this forum, we're talking about slam dunk, powerful, power-packed information field forum. So thank you so very much. So I want to bring back our dear sister, Dr. Angela Y. Davis, into the conversation, just to give just a couple of minutes of concluding remarks before we open it up for a Q&A. Angela, you've had a chance to hear your fellow panelists. They were awesome. I mean, absolutely phenomenal, following in your footsteps, So come on and give us just some concluding remarks, and then we're going to hear from the audience. And take yourself off mute.
Oh, that's what I was doing. So it's not a Zoom webinar if someone doesn't forget to unmute. So we know that. Well, first of all, let me thank everyone for the amazing interventions you've made. This conversation could go on, for the next several days and weeks. But I think I want to make 3 points, and I'm going to try to be succinct, which is not my forte, but I will try. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that abolition is not a single intervention. It's not a single act. It's not a single strike. And this is what we learn from the so-called abolition of slavery. In order to accomplish abolition, we look at the entire society. We look at the changes that will be required, not only in the criminal legal system, not only in the creation of a new form of justice, but how do we reorganize the society in terms of free education, free healthcare, accessible housing, and all of those things that will help to create a different atmosphere of the meaning of safety. Because when we talk about safety and we have no jobs and we have no health care, then it has no meaning. Then I think it's really important to connect the crisis of policing and imprisonment to global capitalism. And it's important to recognize that the buildup of the prison populations began to happen in the 1980s with the emergence of global capitalism and with the privatization of what had previously been available to people simply because they were human beings. And this is an issue that not only affects the US, but it affects countries all over the world. Brazil, for example, has the second highest prison population. Maybe China is second, and then but Brazil is very close to the US. And when we consider, of course, that Brazil has the largest population of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa, we begin to understand why we say that capitalism is always racial capitalism. And so that in order to begin to shift the ways in which criminalization has taken over so many aspects of our society, we have to change that society. And I'm saying that we have to begin to look toward a very different kind of economic arrangement, a socialist arrangement. And then third, I would say that people in prison, people who are currently in prison, hold many of the answers to a lot of the problems we are experiencing here. There is so much talent behind bars. So much intellectual labor is unfolding. And I saw recently a film that I would recommend to all of you, which is called, it's a documentary about people in prison in the state of Washington, and it's called Since I've Been Down. It's an amazing documentary. And when one looks at the way that these men and women have learned how to create curriculum, create university level curriculum, and have learned how to be teachers, and have begun to do many of the things that we should be doing in the so-called free world. And I want to make that point because oftentimes we talk about prisoners as if they're objects, as if they're simply the objects of our efforts to create a better world, and not as if they are full participants on an egalitarian basis. So the third point is that people in prison hold the answers to many of the problems in the larger society. And that is just one more compelling reason why we should embrace a process of abolition.
Brilliantly stated. Thank you so very much. Oh my God, this has just been an awesome, just very, very rich conversation. And we're about to make it a little bit even richer. But we have a very robust Q&A. You all, the panel is able to just click on that. I'm not quite sure if we're going to, don't quite know how to, let me just go through a couple of them and see who wants to answer. There are a couple here for you, Dr. Davis. Someone wants to hear your view as to whether Marxist practice and theory is still as applicable as it once was, whether the current status of the movement requires a new iteration of Marxism. And you all can let me know if you want to answer or if you want to type an answer. And there was another one that I think had your name. Yeah, this is a lot.
I can just briefly respond to that
Okay.
first question. And my response would be that capitalism still exists. And because capitalism still exists, and as a matter of fact, is more exploitative, more violent, and that it threatens the very planet, that we certainly have to address the analyses that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels proposed so many decades ago. And it's not to say that that is the Bible. It's not to say that the full analysis exists intact, but that we build on that analysis. And I think it's especially important to add the dimension of racism, which has been lacking in so much Marxist scholarship, race and gender and other categories. But yeah, I think it's still relevant. I still think it's relevant.
Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. What advice, and this is for the whole panel, for one person on the panel to respond, what advice would you give a young abolitionist in the making besides finding a political home? And is it possible to be an abolitionist and work within the punishment system, such as a public defender at the same time? Is there someone who wants to tackle those two questions? What advice would you give a young abolitionist, and can you kind of work in the system and dismantle it kind of at the same time? Mark?
Yeah, I was going to say, as to the latter question, I think that's a question that every lawyer has to deal with, no matter whether they're employed as a public defender or not. But I always say, look, you know, a worker is a worker. You know, you may have a fancy degree, but you're a worker. Unless you got a lot of capital and you're running this thing, and I don't think most of us are. And so, you know, a worker on an assembly line is helping to, with his labor, produce products that benefit capitalists, but in his or her off time, they can be out there, you know, steady stroking, making revolution. So it's possible to sell capitalism your labor, as long as you don't sell capitalism your soul. And
Wow.
so do the
Great
work
quote.
that you got to do, and don't worry about what you have to do to feed yourself.
Great quote. I like that. Don't sell your soul. What about?
I didn't make that one up either.
Okay, you need to do a book with quotes. Okay, are there examples of systems that address behaviors that violate codes of conduct in a humane and non-punitive way? Anyone can give any examples of systems that can address behaviors that violate codes of conduct, but do so in a humane and non-punitive way? Or it's this part of the visioning that we're talking about that we need to envision and brainstorm and you know, trial and error and think. So I don't know if anyone.
I want to hear Whitley talk about harm-free zones.
All right.
I think in harm-free zone, a lot of what we talk about is restorative justice. And if you look up at the restorative justice programs that are implemented in various parts of the country, you'll see that really it's not about how hard can I punish this. We're not using a sledgehammer just to nail in a little bitty nail. We are thinking about how can I make this community whole? So what harm was done and what needs to happen so that the person who was harmed can feel whole again. And that doesn't mean throwing someone in a cage, but sometimes it may mean, you know, giving that person that item back that was taken from them, and not really ending there with just the person who had the harm done to them, because generally the person doing the harm was originally harmed themselves. And so we have to think about what caused them to do that behavior in the first place and address that initial harm if we don't want to see this cycle continue. So a lot of times when people talk about restorative justice, they think about trying to fill in, or I'm sorry, make up for the harm that was done to the victim per se, but don't really think about the harm that caused the person to do the bad behavior in the first place. And so when we start addressing those deficiencies and the things that people are facing on an everyday basis that leads them to have these behaviors that end up in a courtroom, then we won't see that as much. And so if we start implementing these restorative justice practices across the country, I think that people will really see that the only answer isn't just to put someone in a cage, but there are ways to move past one incident and continue to build as a community.
Yeah, I
So,
was going to add, on the front end of the process too, policing can be reimagined, to the extent that we don't abolish it completely. The definition of a police officer in the minds of most people is a big guy who has, a flak jacket, heavy weaponry, and a taser and a baton, and a badge. That's the police officer, and he's trained to shoot and to kill and to grapple and to arrest. But the things that these guys are asked to do frequently don't require all of that. I mean, they're required to go out and to deal with mental health emergencies. They deal with drug overdoses. They deal with squabbles between neighbors, and they're the least equipped to do those things. And so, if we want to redefine what a police officer is, that's what I think the most immediate, achievable effort to quote unquote defund the police is that you don't reduce their budget, but what you do is you reduce the number of soldiers who are on the police force, and you replace them with psychologists and drug counselors and therapists and mental health professionals and people who are qualified to go out and to respond to the calls that police departments actually get. And so, there are ways to do this. If people are prepared to step out and actually do it.
I think on a similar note to what Mark is saying is really going back to the notion that we rely on our community. So we talk a lot about who are you going to call when something happens? Like if you're not going to call the police, who might you call? And really thinking about how we can use our community to hold one another accountable versus pulling in a system that they know nothing about our community. They don't know who lives here. They don't know how things operate. But having a go-to person when there is a dispute that can come and de-escalate that situation. There's a documentary that I'll put in the chat where there are local community members that are called when certain things happen to try to de-escalate versus calling the police. I think about when I was growing up, a lot of times, everyone knew the parents in the neighborhood, and those parents were responsible for holding all of the kids accountable. And that's really not how the world is operating. It's call the police in your schools nowadays, call the police in your neighborhoods, but really just relying on community. And for us to, I don't want to say police ourselves, but for us to hold one another accountable is another way to start thinking about a harm-free way of holding people accountable.
Okay, let me put a couple more questions in the area. And Daquan, I want you to look at the Q&A also and let me know if there's something in there that you really want to answer. I already know the answer to this one, but I'm going to raise the question anyway. Do you think that elected progressive prosecutors can change and or dismantle the system from within, or do you think they become part of the problem? Would anybody want to address that one quickly? A lot of progressive prosecutors out there, a lot of money to, yeah.
I think that's really important. It's not as if we are arguing that progressive prosecutors are going to change the system, but they can begin to subvert and disrupt the system. And in San Francisco, for example, Chesa Boudin is now the district attorney. And one of the first things he did was to abolish cash bail. So I think it's really important, if we are serious about an abolitionist trajectory, to recognize that people can contribute from wherever they are, that we don't have to demand that every single participant hold the same ideas and perspectives. Abolition is a process, and we're trying to persuade ever increasing numbers of people that we need a very different kind of society. Not only that we don't need prisons, and not only that we want to get rid of violent, racist police, but that we need to be able to imagine living in a very different world. And so I think we should be welcoming to everyone, recognizing limitations and recognizing there's certain things that people can do depending on where they are. But I think that wherever one happens to be, it is always possible to create an arena of struggle, as opposed to assuming that one has to be in a certain place in order to struggle. People who are in the corporate world say that I can't really do anything because I'm in the corporate world. That's an excuse. People who are professors at universities are often assume that because they're facing tenure and so forth, they can't really do anything. But if there is a community of struggle, they can. And I think this is what we're trying to do, produce an ever expanding community of resistance, community of struggle.
I think that's very important. And I like when you said a trajectory, an abolitionist trajectory. And a law student is asking that she struggles thinking about having to work within the legal system, which I find illegitimate and which I've been directly harmed by. I want to infiltrate these spaces within the system, but I also hear Audre Lorde loud and clear that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. How do we reconcile the two? I think you all have kind of been speaking to that when we talk about the trajectory and organizing where we are, but I don't know if anybody wants to just address that very briefly as I look for some other question. I want to bring Daquan into this. Here go one for Daquan while we're holding that. Daquan, how can we encourage impacted people to become active abolitionists without fear of further disenfranchisement? Ooh. I don't know, throwing some of these out.
I would say, what is it to fear? Like, I mean, you're already Black. 9 times out if you're talking about an African American woman, male or child that's been directly impacted, so you already, what is it to fear? I would encourage you to continue to pursue to abolish the criminal justice system for the simple reason that you've been directly impacted and you're formerly incarcerated. And just keep pushing, because you're not only doing it for you, you're doing it for those that come behind us, because they say one in 3 African American young males will be in the criminal justice system in some form of their life. So when you know this, that lets you know that the system is by design. So it's no longer about you as a directly impacted person. The community is directly impacted by the criminal justice system when they constantly incarcerate us at a high rate. So, once they continue to incarcerate us at a high rate, those that are coming back out here and returning to society, who has really felt the pain of the system, who's really understand how the system operates, must now continue to encourage those to do the same as them by organizing and saying, hey, this law is not right, this law is not right, this statute is not right. Let's continue to organize together and just abolish something that we know that's not, don't need to be reformed, but just completely dismantle.
So, in light of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it seems like people were forced to pay attention for the first time to police brutality, the criminal system, and abolition. For people that want to expand their knowledge and become scholars of abolition, where would you all encourage people to start? Anybody?
Well, there is a growing field that usually goes by the name of critical prison studies. It's a field that incorporates abolition. And this is, again, an example of the ways in which people in prison have helped to shape what we are doing in the free world, because this academic field would not have been possible without the early interventions of people behind bars. So it depends. If the person is interested in academic work that is related to activist work, I would encourage them to look at the American Studies Association. There is actually a caucus, a critical prison studies caucus within the ASA. And of course, it involves it involves an interdisciplinarity that draws from so many different academic fields, but also it expands the notion of interdisciplinarity to include knowledge that gets produced outside of the university, knowledge that gets produced in the course of struggles, knowledge that gets produced behind prison walls. So that would be, one way to begin to, look up critical prison studies and look at all of the very interesting writings and analyses that have been developed over the last period.
So I must say that one is new to me. So I'm definitely going to look that up. This is a question I think is very interesting. I hear someone is asking, as a step towards abolishing the police, prison. Wait a minute. No. That wasn't the one. Oh, Lord, I lost it. I'm sorry. Well, I should go on and read that one. But no. I'm sorry. Well, anyway, it had something to do with, we went from the prisons and slavery and this and that. What is the next arena of containment after prisons that you might envision someone might think of? It's in the chat somewhere. I'm not in the chat.
I think that, I don't know what they'll do, but I think that what they're capable of doing is imprisoning our minds even more effectively. I mean, if they're able to effectively persuade us that our fate, our future, our destiny is tied up with capitalism and the capitalists, then we're lost. And that's why I think that we mentally, spiritually, emotionally, politically, and otherwise need to divorce ourselves from the empire. We need to understand that the two things, our future and our prosperity, our success, our liberation, cannot coexist with the perpetuation of the capitalist system. And so if you've got a lot of African people walking around the United States thinking that we're on the verge of overcoming because we had President Obama in the White House, we got problems.
What I want to do now is we're really coming to a close. If you all can just think of one word that you feel would characterize, other than abolition, because that's what we're talking about here, but one word that would encapsulate what we feel we need to be doing for the future. I want each of the panelists, and I know we didn't prepare for this, but just what that one word that you feel, would be. And while you're thinking about that, I just want to, again, draw everyone's attention to the National Conference of Black Lawyers Criminal Justice Section's vision statement that will be posted on the NCBL website very, very soon, ncbl.org. And I really want you to look at that vision statement. The Mark Fancher and Whitley and Ian had a lot to do with producing that vision statement. And what we want to do is really invite interested people to, number one, join NCBL and work with the criminal justice section. Probably renamed that to criminal punishment section, criminal legal. But anyway, to work with us to develop and implement a plan to abolish the criminal punishment system, and two, to take the discussion, ideas, and the vision statement to the groups you work with, and that will continue this critical dialogue. So be sure to go to the NCBL website over the next couple of days, ncbl.org, and look for that vision statement. Go through it. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal, from eliminating the exception clause in the 13th amendment to defunding, divesting police departments, investing in communities, obtaining permanent protections for Black immigrants, etc., promoting mandatory classes on peaceful conflict resolution. It goes on and on, but it's it is the beginnings of this reimagining and this revisioning that we're talking about. So if each of my panelists can give us one word, just before I actually close, one word that you feel that you would like to leave with the audience that we have for this phenomenal webinar this evening. Well, I'm going to end with Dr. Angela Davis. So let's go on and begin with Daquan. Daquan Peters, give us your one word.
Say this one word has to do what? I want to make sure I get the right word, because I know I got some powerful people on here, and I can't be sitting here looking all crazy.
Yeah, you all good, my brother.
So now tell me what this one word got encapsulated.
That you want to leave with everybody. One word of whatever that you want to leave with folk that you wanted them to keep on their minds.
Peace.
Peace. You got it, brother. All right. Whitley, what's your one word, my sister?
Humanity.
Humanity. Mark Fancher.
Pray.
Pray. Oh, absolutely. And Dr. Angela Y. Davis.
Well, may I give you 2 words?
You can give us as many as you want. You have earned it.
Okay. You know, my 2 words are abolition, feminism. Because I think we need a feminist dimension of abolition to understand the relation between the personal and the political, to help us develop an intersectional approach. So my word is abolition, feminism.
You know, I think we need a whole another webinar on that because that's absolutely phenomenal. I really want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank the National Conference of Black Lawyers. I want to thank Angela Y. Davis, Whitley Carpenter, Daquan Peters, Mark Fancher for the valuable contributions that you've made to this issue. I would like to also thank members of the NCBL Criminal Justice Section who contributed to the success of this webinar, specifically Florence Morgan, Ajua Ayatoro, Jeffrey Edison, Ann Mitchell, Dwayne Dewey Boyd, Laura Harlan, Marcus Pollard, Yvonne Lewis, and I'm sure I probably missed folk, but to charge it to my head and not to my heart. I want to thank everyone out there in Zoom land. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. We are saving the chat, and the recording of this webinar will be available sometime next week. So just stay tuned for information on that. It'll probably be announced as part of the NCBL website. So again, thank you, everyone. And the word I will leave you with is power.